The ship docked at Drath Prime at exactly the hour the Drath wanted it to. Dock, that was the first thing Nina Gale noticed, not the towers, not the sky, which was a color she did not have a name for, somewhere between green and the feeling of being watched, not the 800 ceremonial guards standing in two perfect lines from the docking gate all the way to the reception hall, each one holding a weapon that probably had a long and very formal name. She noticed the timing. They had been held in orbit for exactly 42 minutes before receiving clearance to descend, not 40, not 45. 42, long enough to remind them who owned this guy, short enough to stay technically courteous. Nina bit into her granola bar and watched the docking clamps lock into place. Aaron Beck stood 2 steps behind her with both their bags over one shoulder and the look on his face he always had, which was no look at all. He had been doing security for the diplomatic corps for 9 years. He had stopped having expressions somewhere around year 3. He watched the guards through the small porthole window and said nothing. There were 5 of them total. Nina, Aaron, 2 junior attaches named Paul and Deb, who were both 26 and still thought all of this was extraordinary, and Ambassador Luke Crane, who was 61 and had gout and had been to Drath Prime 4 times before and would rather have been home. 5 humans, 800 guards. The math was not subtle. The docking ramp opened and the air came in cool, thin, carrying something floral. That was probably not a flower. Paul and Deb both straightened up like they were about to meet someone important. Lou walked out first because that was protocol. Nat finished her granola bar, folded the wrapper into her jacket pocket and followed. The reception hall was the size of a city block and built out of something that was not quite stone and not quite metal, but had been standing for longer than any human structure on Earth. The ceiling was so high it had its own weather. The light came from everywhere and nowhere, soft and gold and completely sourceless. Way light behaves in dreams. Along the walls, carved reliefs told the history of the Drath Dominion in images. 600 years of expansion, contact, and what the plaques delicately called resolution. Every species that had ever stood across from the Drath in a military engagement appeared somewhere in those carvings. Most of them appeared only once. Lou had explained this to Nina before her first visit 7 years ago. She had looked at the carvings for a long time that first day. She didn't look at them now. She had done her looking up in the gallery above the hall behind a long panel of something clear and dark that was not quite glass. Princess Veryl Drathorin stood and watched the delegation arrive. She was 24 years old in a way that meant nothing, because Drath aging did not map cleanly onto human ears, but her bearing was older than her face. She stood the way buildings stand, not rigid, just permanent. Her hair was silver white, pulled back without ornament because she was the ornament. The gown she wore was the color of deep water. Her hands were folded at her waist. She had been briefed on the delegation. She had read Nina Gale's file twice. She had read Aaron Beeks's file once and then gone back and read one specific section 3 more times, which she had not told anyone. She had reviewed the full history of human diplomatic contact, going back to the first encounter 30 years ago, and she had reviewed the military record, and she had reviewed the ceasefire terms, and she had framed all of it correctly in her mind the way her Tutors had taught her the war was a miscalculation, unusual but resolved. The humans were a young species with an irregular military history and no meaningful territorial ambitions. They were manageable. She watched Nina Gale walk off the ship eating something. Var. Counsel Dren stood to her left. He was 60 years old and had been serving the Drath government since before Varel was born. He had clearance she did not yet have. He had reviewed files she could not yet access. He stood with his hands behind his back and watched the humans cross the reception hall below, and he did not look at them with contempt. He looked at them the way a careful man looks at a door he once opened by mistake. Varel noticed his posture. She had been noticing Dren's posture for 2 days since the delegation's arrival had been confirmed. There was something in it that did not match the official framing she had been given. She filed it away. She said nothing. Below the welcome ceremony began. A senior herald stepped forward and began the formal recitation. The Draft Dominion's full military honors, 600 years of them, each campaign listed by name and resolution date. It was not a boast. It was simply what you did when you welcomed a delegation. You read the record. You let them understand where they were standing. It took 40 minutes. Al stood through it with his hands clasped and his gout and his patience, because this was also not his first time. Paul and Deb stood very still and tried to look like they had expected this. Aaron stood the way he always stood, which was weight balanced, eyes moving, saying nothing. Nas stood with her hands in her jacket pockets when the herald finished and turned to the human delegation for the reciprocal honors. A shorter list, a much shorter list, though the last item, honor, had a strange gravity that the herald read without inflection. Lou stepped forward and said the appropriate words. He had said them before. He said them cleanly and with the right weight, and sat back down. The dinner invitation was extended. The rooms were assigned. The first day of the Concordat renewal had officially begun. Varel watched from the gallery as the humans were escorted out of the reception hall. She watched until they were gone. Then she stood for a moment longer, looking at the empty space where they had been. Dren had not moved. They are smaller than I expected, she said. They often are, Dren said. She looked at him. He was still watching the door they had left through. You have reviewed the full archive, she said. It was not a question. Yes, and yet you stand like that. He did not answer immediately. When he did, his voice was even professional, the voice of a man who had been professionally even for 60 years. I stand, however I stand, Your Highness. She looked at him for one more second, then she turned and walked toward the corridor below in the reception hall, growing quieter as the staff moved through it. One of the junior Drath officials was relaying the order of the evening's dinner to a colleague, speaking in low tones about seating arrangements and the translated menu and the timing of the formal toast. Neither of them had clearance for the archive. They were, Varel thought, the lucky ones. Down the corridor in the human guest quarters, Nina dropped her bag on the bed, looked at the ceiling, and said to Aaron, Cole would have hated this place. She was already checking the event schedule before she finished the sentence. 3 corridors away, Vansel Dren stopped walking. He stood very still for exactly 4 seconds. Then he continued down the hall. Varel did not sleep. This was not unusual. She had not slept easily in years, which was the kind of thing a princess did not say. To anyone, and so she had not said it to anyone. She lay in the guest chamber. They had prepared for her a room she had seen before on her one prior visit to this wing, and which smelled faintly of the same sourceless floral air as the rest of the station, and she looked at the ceiling and thought about Dren's posture. After an hour she gave up on the ceiling. She pulled up her personal data slate and opened the summary document on the human conflict. She had read it before. She had read it 3 times in the 2 weeks before this trip, actually, which he also had not told anyone. It was a mid-level document, not classified, written for senior diplomatic staff who needed context without needing details. It used clean, structured language the way all draft official documents did, and it told the story of the human conflict the way you tell a child about a bad dream. The shape of it, yes, but not the weight. She read it again. The early sections were familiar. First contact had been routine. The humans had a small number of ships and a single inhabited system, and no particular reason to be noticed. There had been a border dispute, not unusual. Borders always disputed when expansion happened, and the Drath had sent a fleet as they always did, and the humans had not retreated, which was unusual but not unheard of. What came after that was where the documents started doing something strange. Veryl had noticed it on her second reading. The language changed, not dramatically. There were no obvious breaks, no shift in tone that a casual reader would catch, but she was not a casual reader. She had been trained by people who believe that how you say a thing is always as important as what you say. Around page 12, the document stopped describing events and started describing reactions to events. Fleet commanders were described as requesting additional guidance, then requesting it again, then filing formal uncertainty reports, which was a category of document she had never heard of before, and which he suspected had been invented specifically for this situation. The phrase outside of standard modeling appeared 4 times in 6 pages. She reached page 18, where the document described the third ceasefire offer. The humans had declined it. The document called this a strategic decision and moved on. Veryl read that line again. The third offer, the fleet was still intact. The exit was open. The terms were by all recorded accounts reasonable, and the human commander had looked at all of that and said no and kept going. The document called it a strategic decision. She thought about Dren standing at that window watching the delegation cross the hall. She put in the clearance request for the full archive file. She labeled it routine research ahead of the Concordat signing. She submitted it at the second hour of the night and expected to wait until morning. The approval came back in 6 minutes. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened the file. The full archive was a different kind of document. It was older, assembled during the war itself, updated in real time by military scribes who had clearly started the project with confidence and ended it doing something that looked in places like asking for help. The early entries were precise and orderly. Dates, positions, fleet numbers, outcomes. The Drath recorded everything. It was their greatest strength, and Veryl was beginning to suspect sometimes their greatest source of distress. Entry 41. The human commander had been identified. The document listed his designation. The Drath filing system, a long alpha numeric code, and then in parentheses the human naming convention. she skipped. Past it, she would come back to it. Entry 57, the fourth battle in the Arash. Corridor. By the numbers, this engagement should have ended the conflict. The Drath fleet was larger, better supplied, and holding the dominant position. The human commander had fewer ships, a damaged primary vessel, and according to intercepted communications, was running low on a resource the scribes had footnoted as something consumed by human personnel. During long operations, he had attacked. Anyway, the entry noted in the clipped neutral language of military record that this was outside of standard modeling. Entry 63, the fifth ceasefire offer. The human commander had asked for 24 hours to consider it and then sent back a single line refusal that the scribes had transcribed in full, including the closing word. The closing word was a human profanity that the translator had declined to render directly and instead described as an expression of dismissal. Common among human infantry, it had been filed without further comment. Entry 71. The senior modeling team had submitted a formal report stating that they could not predict the human commander's next action with any reliable accuracy and requesting a temporary suspension of their assessments until new frameworks could be built. The request had been denied. The assessments had continued. They had been wrong every time, and then there was a gap Varel had been aware of. The gap in the summary document, a clean deletion, bureaucratically tidy, the kind that could only be authorized at the highest level. She had assumed it was short, a few missing pages maybe. Some piece of information deemed too sensitive for the mid-level file. The gap in the full archive was 31 pages. She could see the page numbers. They went from 74 to 106. Everything in between had been removed. The document continued on page 106 as if it had never stopped, in language that was noticeably different from what came before. Flatter, more careful, like someone who has just had a scare and is talking slowly on purpose. Entry 106 simply said ceasefire terms agreed, both parties signing. Entry 107, the human commander's final communication to Drath High Command, transcribed in full. It was 4 words. It said in human standard *, sure that works. *, that was it. 600 years of unbroken Drath military dominance. 31 deleted pages and 4 words. *, sure that works. *, Varel sat with the slate in her hands for a long time. She looked at the gap. She thought about requesting the deleted section. Her clearance was high enough now. She could ask for it. She would probably get it. She did not ask for it. She went back to the beginning of the file to entry 41 to the parenthetical human name. 2 words. She had heard one of them before, a common human given name. Nothing notable, but the 2 words together had a weight she could not explain and did not want to examine too closely. She looked at them for a long time, then she said them quietly, alone in her chamber, just to know what they felt like in her mouth. Her own voice surprised her. She put the slate down. She did not sleep for the rest of the night. The state dinner was the kind of event that had been planned by 14 people over 6 months and would be reviewed by 12 more people afterward, and Nina had been to enough of them to know that the food was never actually the point. The food was just the reason everyone was in the same room with their guards down and their mouths occupied. The real work happened in the pauses between courses, in the careful small talk, in who sat, where and what they chose to talk about, and more importantly, what they chose not to. She was on her third glass of the Drath ceremonial drink, which tasted like someone had dissolved a flower in silver paint and then added warmth to it from somewhere she couldn't identify. Two separate Drath officials had told her politely that it was stronger than it seemed. She had thanked them both and continued drinking because that was just who she was. Aaron was not drinking. Aaron never drank at these things. He sat 2 seats down from her, with water in front of him and his eyes doing what they always did, which was move without appearing to move, checking the room in slow, patient arcs that looked like nothing at all. The table seated 40. Lou was at the near end, deep in a formal exchange with the Drath High Administrator about trade corridor updates, which was going to take until dessert at minimum. Paul and Deb were near the middle, doing well. They had stopped looking amazed by everything, which was a good sign. Being amazed at state dinners made the other side feel like a tourist attraction. Princess Veril sat across the table, 6 guests between them, close enough to hear far enough that direct conversation required intention. She was eating almost nothing. Nin noticed, and listening to everything. Veril had not slept. Nad did not know this, but she could see it the way she could always see it in people. Very slight flatness behind the eyes, the kind that expensive composure could hide from most people, but not from someone who had been reading rooms professionally for 11 years. Conversation had moved, as it always did at these dinners, toward history, toward the Concordat, toward the shape of things before the signing, and what had changed since. A Draths administered 2 seats to Naz left, a precise, formal man with very strong opinions about treaty language had started talking about the poetry of good diplomacy, which Nenna disagreed with entirely, and said so, which made him blink and then surprisingly smile and then start arguing back with what seemed like genuine pleasure. A treaty is a legal document, Nenna said. It should read like one. The moment you start putting metaphors in a ceasefire agreement, you give both sides room to argue about what the metaphor means, and nobody wants that. And yet the Soreth Concordat of the Third Era is considered the finest diplomatic document in Drath history, the subminister said, and it opens with verse. How long did the Soreth Concordat hold? A small pause. 80 years. I rest my case, Nina said, and finished her glass. Someone at the far end of the table had been talking about commanders, about the figures attached to the big moments, the ceasefire, the border agreements, the early contact years. The Drath spoke about their commanders with the weight of people reading names off a monument, which was more or less what they were doing. Long names, full titles, every honorific in the correct order, respectful, formal, the kind of language that turns a person into a symbol before they're even done being a person. Human side was not doing that. Ambassador Lau mentioned a woman named Carol Briggs who had handled the first contact protocols and described her as sharp as a tack and terrible at parallel parking, which I know because I saw her try it once in Nairobi. A junior attaché from the human side mentioned a fleet captain who had apparently fallen asleep in a briefing once and snored loud enough that the recording had to be redone. The Drath at the table listened to this with the careful attention of people trying to understand a language They have studied but never heard spoken. Natively, the conversation arrived. Eventually at the ceasefire, it always arrived at the ceasefire. 11 years was not very long historically. The wound was closed, but the scar was still visible if you knew where to look, and everyone at this table knew where to look. The Drath's minister mentioned the Drath commander who had signed the final terms, full name, 3 honorifics, a brief description of his service record. Everyone on the Drath side nodded with recognition. Lu mentioned the human admiral who had overseen the final phase of negotiations. From the diplomatic side, gave her name. Said she was retired now and doing consulting work in Brussels, which was apparently a place on Earth that Nena nodded at because it was real and she'd been there. And then Nena set her glass down. She was not making a speech. She was not building to anything. She was just talking the way she always talked at these dinners after the third glass. Easily, without architecture, one thought. Connecting to the next the way stones connect across a shallow stream. You want to talk about the ceasefire. You should have seen Cole trying to explain to command why he accepted terms that fast. Took him 3 full reports. Man hates paperwork more than he hated the war. She smiled, the warm, fond smile of someone remembering a colleague. She reached for her glass. The chair scraped. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the sound of something happening before the person it was happening to could stop it. The way a glass falls off a table before your hand gets there. Princess Veryl Drathorin's knees hit the floor. One hand caught the edge of the table. The other came down beside her knee. Her head dropped forward for a single second. Not in a bow, not in a performance, in the involuntary private way a person's head drops when something hits them somewhere that has been undefended for a long time. Then the composure came back. It was extraordinary to watch. 3 seconds, maybe 4. She pressed against the table edge. She rose. She straightened. By the time she was fully upright, her face had been rebuilt into something functional, not perfect, functional. The table was completely silent. Every eye on the Drath side was either on Veryl or carefully on something else. Every Drath official present had made a choice in those 3 seconds about where to look, and that choice itself said everything. Dren had not looked away. He had watched. He did not look surprised. Aaron had not looked away either. Na's glass was still in her hand, halfway to her mouth, where it had stopped when the chair scraped. Veryl looked directly at her, across the table over the 6 guests. Between them, clearly direct, the look of someone who has decided that further composure is less important than the answer to a specific question. That name, she said in clean, unaccented human standard. He is alive. Nena set the glass down very carefully. She looked at Aaron. Aaron looked back at her with no expression, which was his way of saying, yes, this is actually happening. No, I don't know what to do about it either. She looked back at Veryl. Last I heard, he was growing tomatoes in Vermont. Nobody moved. The sourceless golden light held everything exactly where it was. The silence went on long enough that it became its own kind of answer. The meeting was held the next morning in a small room off the diplomatic wing that had no windows and very good acoustics, and felt to Nina like a room that had been used before for conversations that nobody wanted. Overheard. Veryl came alone. No escort, no scribe, no one standing at the door. She arrived before the humans did, which meant she had been sitting at the table already when Nena, Aaron, and Lou walked in, and the image of her sitting, their straight-backed hands folded in a room she had presumably arranged for this purpose, told Nas several things at once. Lou tried to open with the form greeting. Veril stopped him with one raised hand politely, but with no room in it, and said she would prefer to keep the meeting informal. Lou sat down. He had been a diplomat long enough to know when the other side needed to steer. She placed a data slate on the table between them. I want to show you something, she said. I'm not doing this as a representative of the Drath Dominion. I am not doing this as part of the Concord proceedings. She paused. I am doing this because I read a file last night that I should have read a long time ago, and I find that I would like someone else in the room to have also read it. Lou looked at Nina. Nena looked at the slate. All right, she said. Veril did not push the slate forward. She just began to speak. She told them about the Drath military record. Not with pride. She was not proud of it exactly the way you are not proud of your height or the color of your eyes. It was simply what was true. 600 years, every engagement, every species that had stood opposite a draft fleet and made a decision about what to do next, most of them had made the reasonable decision, the one that the numbers supported, the one that meant they got to continue existing as a political body with borders and a government and a future. The draft had not lost. This was not a boast. She said it the way you say the sky is a certain color without celebration. And then she said there was the human conflict. She told them about the modeling teams, about the formal uncertainty reports. She used that phrase and watched Nena's face go still in a way that meant Nena understood what she was hearing. She told them about the ceasefire offers, 3 of them, each one reasonable, each one declined. She did not editorialize. She laid the facts down the way you lay tiles flat, even one beside the other, and let the patent speak. We have very good models, Veril said. We have been building them for 6 centuries. We can predict with high accuracy what a military force will do when it is outmatched, when its exit is open, when the cost of continuing rises past the value of the objective. She looked at the slate. Our models failed completely. Every time. Lou was listening with the careful stillness of a man who had served in the war before his diplomatic career. He did not say anything, and then there is the deletion in the archive. Veril said the what? Nina said 31 pages. Veril's voice stayed even. Filed during the final phase of the conflict, authorized for removal at the highest level. The document continues on the other side of it as if nothing happened, except that the language is different, slower, more careful. She folded her hands on the table. I did not open the deleted section. Why not? Veril looked at her directly. Because I could calculate from the language before and after roughly what it must contain, and I decided that I did not need it. Confirmed. The room was quiet. Nina looked at the slate. She thought about reaching for it. She decided not to. What are you trying to tell us? Lou said. I am trying to tell you, Veril said, that we have a word in giraffe. It is used for natural events, for phenomena that occur outside of prediction. Storms, seismic events, the behavior of stars at the end of their lives, things without intent, things that do not negotiate and do not tire and do not respond to reason, because reason is not part of their structure. She stopped. We do not use this word for people. She stopped again. We use it for one person. Lou sat back very slowly. Aaron, who had said nothing since entering the room, was looking at a spot on the wall just above Veryl's head. Nina recognized this. It was what he did when he was thinking about something he did not want his face to show. Cole's just a guy, Nina said. The words came out the way they always came out when she said them. Easy, fond, with the slight exasperation of someone defending a friend who keeps being misunderstood. He's got bad knees. He grows tomatoes. He calls me on my birthday and talks for 40 minutes about composting. Veryl looked at her for a long time. Yes, she said, I believe that is true. So then that is also somehow the problem, Veryl said, not despite those things, because of them. Nina opened her mouth. She closed it. She thought about Cole Harrow, the real one. Not the file, not the name in the archive, the one who complained about his left knee every time the weather changed, who sent her a jar of tomato sauce every September with a note that just said asterisk told you so. Isk, who had never, not once in the year she had known him, talked about the war. Veryl turned to Aaron. You served, she said. It was not a question. Yes, Aaron said. You were present for some of the final engagements. Some of them. Then I have one question. Veryl's hands were very still on the table. Why did he stop? After everything, after the 3 refusals, after the deleted pages, after whatever is in that section of the archive that I chose not to open, why did he accept the terms when he did? Aaron was quiet for a moment. His eyes came down from the wall and settled on Veryl's face. He said the war was over. Aaron said, so it was over. Veryl looked at him. She sat with that for a long time. Then she reached forward and picked up the data slate. She held it for a moment, looking at it the way you look at something you are about to put away for good. I see, she said. She closed the file. That evening, alone at the window overlooking Drath Prime, all its towers, all its centuries, all the long unbroken record of a civilization that had never once been made to stop and recalculate itself. Vel stood in the dark and thought about a man talking to his tomatoes in a place she had only seen on a map. She thought about 31 deleted pages. She thought about Dren's posture. She thought about the word they used for natural events. She did not open the deleted section. She had made that decision the night before, and she did not unmake it. Some things she was learning were better known by their shape than by their contents. She stood at the window until the lights of the city below blurred slightly. She did not let herself think too hard about what it meant that she was choosing not to know something that she, who had been trained since childhood on the idea that knowledge was the only real power, that uncertainty was a weakness, that a good leader read every file, was standing at a window in the dark, holding a deliberate gap in her own understanding. She stood there a long time. The city went on being itself below her. 600 years of confidence lit up in the dark. It did not make her feel better. Of the signing happened the way these things always happened, which was slowly and with a great deal of ceremony around something that was at its core two groups of people agreeing to keep agreeing. The hall was the formal one, smaller than the reception hall, more intimate in the way that a room built for legal weight is intimate, with low ceilings and a specific kind of lighting that makes everything feel like it is being preserved for the record, which it Every signing was recorded from 4 angles. The Drath kept the recordings in an archive that Nina suspected was very, very well organized. The Drath officials signed first. Each one came forward, stated their name and title for the record, pressed their mark to the treaty slate and stepped back. It was orderly and precise, and each signature was placed in exactly the right position because, of course, it was Lou signed for the human delegation. He stated his name, title, his commission number, and signed it. His handwriting was atrocious, as it always was, and Nina had long ago stopped being embarrassed about it. Then Nina signed attaché for diplomatic affairs. Her title read on the formal record, which he had always thought was a very long way of saying she was the one who handled what happened when the formal record didn't quite cover the situation. She checked the date box. She wrote the month and day, and then looked at it. She had written them in the wrong order. She exhaled through her nose, made a small sound of personal defeat that she did not bother to muffle, and requested a correction. The Drath Jr. official standing nearest her looked briefly as though he had swallowed something wrong. Paul and Deb did not laugh, which Nina appreciated. Aaron looked at the ceiling, which was his version of laughing. She signed again, correctly this time, and stepped back. That was it. 11 years extended to 21. The Concordat renewed. The hall held a moment of formal silence that the Drath treated as sacred and the humans treated as respectful, which was close enough. The formal reception that followed was shorter than the dinner, more structured. People standing with drinks, making the last round of the correct conversations, saying the right things about cooperation and shared futures. Nina worked the room because that was a job, and she was good at it, moving from cluster to cluster with her drink and her instinct for what a given conversation needed, which was sometimes information and sometimes a joke and sometimes just the signal that the human side was present and paying attention. She was talking to a Drath cultural minister about translation conventions when she felt the shift in the room, not loud, not dramatic, just a change in the social temperature around a particular point in the space, the way a room changes when someone with a certain kind of weight moves through it. She turned. Vale was crossing the room toward her. She came alone, without the social buffer of staff or attendants, which at an event like this was technically a minor break in form. Nina noticed 3 Draft officials clock it and then looked carefully at their drinks. She stopped in front of Nina. The cultural minister excused himself with impressive speed. The renewal holds for 10 years, Vale said. Her voice was composed. Her face was composed. Everything about her was composed in the way it always was, with the one difference Nina had been tracking all day. Behind the composure, something was different than it had been 2 days ago, harder to name than tiredness, something more like a person who has put something down that they had been carrying for a long time without knowing it. Yep, Nina said. Vale was quiet for a moment. She looked at her own glass, then back at Nina. If at any point in the next 10 years, she said carefully, the individual in question were to become involved in any active military capacity, she did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Nina looked at her. She did not look away, and she did not fill the silence with something easy. He's retired, she said. He's done. Yes, Vale said. I am aware that he is done. A breath. I am asking you to ensure that he remains so. Nenna had been a diplomat for 11 years. She had sat across from 7 different species. She had negotiated during a crisis at 2:00 in the morning with a translator who spoke 4 of the 6 necessary languages and had to improvise the other 2. She had once talked a junior draft official out of a formal incident because his translation software had rendered her offhand comment about American football as a territorial declaration. She had never been asked this directly, not in documents, not in treaty language with its careful architecture of maybe and provided that, and notwithstanding just one person looking at another person and saying, "Keep that man where he is. For all of us, please." "Okay, Nenna," said Veril. Nodded once. She turned and walked back through the room without looking back, and the social temperature shifted again in her wake, and within 30 seconds she was surrounded by the appropriate level of staff, and the reception continued as though nothing had happened. Aaron appeared at Nenna's elbow. She had not seen him cross the room. She never did. They stood together for a moment, watching the room do what receptions do: settle, circulate wind slowly toward its own conclusion. "You going to tell Cole any of this?" Aaron said. Now looked at him. She looked back at the room, at Veril on the far side of it, composed and formal and carrying something behind her eyes that she had not been carrying 3 days ago. And then out the tall, narrow windows at Drath Prime, all its towers and its centuries, and its long, unbroken belief in its own understanding of the world. "No," she said. Aaron nodded. "Good call." They stood there a moment longer. Then the reception continued, and the forms were observed, and the correct goodbyes were said, and the human delegation walked down the corridor toward the docking wing, and the shuttle lifted clear of Drath Prime and climbed up through that unnamed color of sky, and the city shrank below them until it was just light, and then less than light, and then gone. Now sat in her seat and thought about a jar of tomato sauce with a handwritten note, asterisk told you so. She thought about a man who had looked at a war and decided it was over. And so it was. She thought about 31 deleted pages sitting in a Drath archive on a planet that had been afraid of a name for 11 years, and the fact that the name belonged to someone who talked to his vegetables and complained about his. Nay. She leaned her head back against the seat. Aaron sat across from her, quiet as always, looking at nothing in particular. He'd still hate it by the way she said Drath Prime, the whole thing. The lighting, Aaron said. Lighting, she said, and the drinks and the ceremony and the carvings. He'd spend the whole trip complaining about the carvings. Aaron almost smiled. Almost. The shuttle moved through the dark, carrying them home. Behind them, in the archive on Drath Prime, 31 pages sat in the dark and stayed there, undisturbed, unread. The tomatoes, somewhere in Vermont, were probably doing fine.